I'm Mari. Now, Sean Jacobs is a Papua New Guinean-born Australian writer, government relations and public policy specialist. He has worked at all levels of government in Australia, New Zealand and Papua New Guinea, and holds a degree in international relations from Griffith University and postgraduate certificate in policing, intelligence and counter-terrorism from Macquarie University. His latest book is Thoroughly Modern Patriots, over there, which is about the monarchy, Australia, the monarchy and a fair fight. His other two books were Winners Don't Cheat, Advice for Young Australians from a Young Australian, and a biography on Neville Bonner, Australia's first Indigenous parliamentarian. He is currently a Masters of Business Administration student at Griffith University and lives in Brisbane with his wife, Eloise. He has been a proud member of Australians for Constitutional Monarchy for almost a decade and serves on the committee for the Australian National Flag Association of Queensland. Please make Sean welcome.
Thank you, Mary. Because you've got your own. Oh, yeah, sure. Okay. I think I can leave it on, maybe.
Liam, leave it on.
Yeah. And Liam, you got me okay? Perfect. All right, well, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, Marie. That's really tremendous of you. I think we first met a few months ago at the, that's right, at a book event on Neville Bonner, as Marie mentioned, as our first Indigenous parliamentarian. And just very quickly, a quick shout out to David Janetsky MP, who's a good friend, a good man, but also a good patriot as well. Thank you everyone, of course, for the opportunity to say a few words and speak this afternoon. I'd also just like to thank David as well, David Van Gend. Thank you for having me. And of course, Anthony Capello from Concord Publishing. Anthony does a tremendous job publishing Australian authors right here in Australia, right here in southeast Queensland. And his support is absolutely tremendous and I'm very grateful for that. Also my lovely wife Eloise for making the trip up with me and being a constant supporter. And of course John Standley as well. John's constant liaison over the last almost 12 months, and with all the postponements that we've had, have meant that I have probably been the most prepared for any remarks I think I've ever been, ever. But it is actually tremendous to be here, and I am really reminded of Edmund Burke's term, little platoons, and the importance of little platoons for democracy. The title of my book, of course, is Thoroughly Modern Patriot, and my address was going to be titled Being Modern Patriots, and I will get to that, but of course it would be remiss if I didn't touch on the events and the sadness in particular of the last few days. And on Friday morning I put together a short piece for The Spectator where I touched on these themes in particular: duty, service and acknowledging change. And if you study the Queen, and many of us know her journey and her story, it was those themes that constantly emerged to me and kept coming out time and time again. But also I think threading those together was a common touch. So I think it was this real element of gauging the public mood that was really critical and important. Who, for example, could forget the Queen playing Bond Girl at the 2012 London Games, and then also just having a marmalade sandwich with Paddington Bear only a mere matter of months ago. So again, it was really these three themes that kept coming back to me. But what I do think that those two examples just highlight are actually humility, but also just a hint of self-deprecation as well. Just a modest amount, but I think those sorts of elements are really important for institutional longevity, and especially when it comes to an institution, like David mentioned, that goes back well over 800 years. And I think, those things again really stuck out to me in particular, from a life that was very well lived of service, duty and acknowledging change, and crossing over with 15 prime ministers, 14 US presidents and countless more leaders as well. So it's also with these ideals that I actually put the book together. And at the start of the book, I tell a very short parable in 5 minutes and 20 years. So there's a man walking through a park and he sees a portrait painter. So he decides to get his portrait painted. And then after 5 minutes, the artist is finished and he says to the man, "That'll be $100. And the man goes, $100, but it only took you 5 minutes. And the artist replies, 5 minutes and 20 years. And I think it's just such a really neat parable or analogy to think about our institutions. And of course, I think once again to think about our institutions in that positive way, but then also how they've been transplanted from cold, wet islands in the North Atlantic onto Australian soil. And I'm also reminded here of when you think about parables like this of former UK Prime Minister Gordon Brown's comment that in establishing democracy and the rule of law, the first 400 to 500 years were always the hardest. But really what I wanted to show as well as part of the book is that being a proud constitutional monarchist or proud of our system really is not about staying stuck in the past, that you can actually think about being a proud constitutional monarchist and principles, and I'll step through some of these. Now, whenever you look or examine Republican arguments, they tend to see our constitutional monarchy almost like an old computer. They view it with a huge amount of utility. So you put something in and you expect something out of it. And of course, some of these questions are provoked. Why is privilege at the centre of our system? What gender is the crown? What religion? All these sorts of things tend to emerge. Indeed, there's a very strong expectation of utility. And of course, now identity is slowly creeping into Republican arguments, and that's particularly noticeable over the past 4 years in particular. And of course, some of this is fair enough. We have every right to question our institutions and prod them at the right moment, and that of course includes the Crown. But I think there's clearly discomfort from the Republican camp to speak of our system in terms of a symbolism. And I've got this lovely quote here from the late Roger Scruton, who talked about, and this again alludes somewhat to David's comment before about the bear pit down below, but politics really is separate and distinct from the Crown. And I think one of the things that I do see when taking on Republicans in different arguments and different forums and unpacking what they've got to say is they tend to mash a lot of our problems or problems in public life. Of course, political, economic and social problems require corresponding solutions. And again, I think Republicans often confuse the two, and replacing our entire system of government in service of that is obviously not a correct idea, and dissatisfaction shouldn't drive institutional change. So the fact Australia is a constitutional monarchy, isn't likely to be on the minds, of course, of many Australians. It's not going to have too much to do with how fast we drive down the road or how much tax we pay, but it does speak to the instincts that Australians possessed. So I think in terms of our proud history and civic life, our responsibilities and the rights that we enjoy, responsible government, and the expectations and the bonds that we put on each other as citizens as well. And I think ultimately, the fact that Australia is a constitutional monarchy is a reflection of good people as well as good institutions. And the thing is, when it actually comes to utility, we can talk about that as constitutional monarchists. What other governments, for example, have had the political stability that we've had? I believe America, for example, has had 21 government shutdowns since 1976. We've not even had one, or of course came close to one in 1975. So decisiveness and authority aren't the only criteria for powers around a head of state, but they do come close. So what is a modern patriot? So in the book I touch on these 4 themes about where a monarchist mindset can actually help us to inform or think about our contemporary challenges. The book's not a policy manifesto, but really what it comes down to is being principled or informed to think about some of our biggest challenges. So the first one, in terms of federation reform, it's often referred to as the index patient of government. You fix federation, you can fix problems such as duplication, overlap, waste, and the blame game between Canberra and the states. And of course, if you looked at our constitution and you look at government service delivery today, they're two very different beasts. You'd also want to return education and health to the states. And of course, the big problem, now I'm not saying that this is the solution, but the big problem, of course, is that states and territories only collect around 15% of income tax revenue. I think that's right, David, in the Shadow Treasurer. But obviously, taxation is a constitutional power of the federal government, and states and territories have been offered it twice since Federation and actually turned it down. Now, of course, not everyone will agree, but I think if you actually go back to basics and actually look at our constitution, then it actually postures one for reform. It doesn't mean staying stuck in the past. Now, cutting green and red tape, I think this is actually a key priority if you're a constitutional monarchist. Now, why I talk about this is because a lot of Republicans care deeply about our perception in Asia and how we're actually seen as a nation. And a lot of them say that a lot of Asian nations are confused by our institutional heritage, and I really don't think that that's the case, especially in a part of the world that respects tradition and also the kinship group and also elements of culture as well. But I do think if we're really concerned about how we're perceived, and Republicans included, but also constitutional monarchists as well, then I think red and green tape does more to harm our perception in Asia than our constitutional status as a constitutional monarchy. And I think, for example, and I talk about this in the book, that the company Adani spent about 11 years in the approvals process and had to put together 22,000 pages of environmental impact assessment. Again, I do think that something like that with a major trading partner does more to harm our image than our constitutional status. I also talk about careful sovereignty. So another keen argument, if you go back to John Dunmore Lang in the 1860s, it was probably one of our first Republicans in Australia, but also more recently as well, if you look at Malcolm Turnbull's fighting for the Republic in 1993, there's a constant complaint about British parliaments and British governments making decisions for Australians and Australian policy. But I do think that as modern patriots, we need to think about sovereignty and how this actually applies and how we apply it in a modern sense. As we know, we've become completely untethered from Britain in a formal sense. And I can remember looking at Bob Hawke's 1998 Constitutional Convention, and one of the remits of that convention was actually look at when independence actually occurred. Of course, the best legal minds in the country at the time said it was sometime between 1926 and World War II. And others argue it was actually 1931 with the Statute of Westminster. And of course, some will say it's even earlier. But what we do know from our constitutional arrangements is that we are fully independent when it comes to self-rule, negotiating treaties, making laws and regulating our own affairs and creating foreign policy. Sovereignty is critical, of course, especially in our current environment when we're thinking about foreign interference and IMAs as well. And of course, I think it's really important that Parliament's sovereignty is respected at the same time. We want key decisions not to be farmed out to courts, but are really for our MPs to make, and certainly not for an Australian president. The other element too is just around reigniting CHOGM, so the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. We're part of a diverse, but single institution that of course goes back, like I mentioned, well over 800 years. But thinking about a genuinely diverse 53 states and 2.4 billion people, that is quite a network, and it shows the appeal, not just the diversity, but the appeal of the Crown and constitutional monarchy as well. So just wrapping up, once again, and as I alluded to at the start, constitutional monarchists are often accused of staying stuck in time and being visionless. But what I thought was really important to cite in the book was a vision. And I'll just read it out because I think it's quite important to actually bring home. What we want from a future Australia is where we can celebrate patriotism without flamboyance or resentment, but with gratitude and humility. A future not crammed with endless dreaming, but practical people wanting to fix practical problems. Communities striving for equality and opportunity. Of government steadied by the will of the people and seeking to get the big things right. And continuing to look within but also to our region for our most tenacious wins. Thank you very much. That wraps up the formal part of my remarks, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.